Herzlich willkommen im Haus der Kulturen der Welt zur Eröffnung der Konferenz. Eine Einstellung zur Arbeit, dies ist der Titel des Projektes von Eine und Harun Farocki und der soeben in unserem Haus eröffneten Ausstellung. Dies ist auch der Titel der dreitägigen internationalen Konferenz, die anlässlich und begleitend zur Ausstellung stattfindet und heute Abend ihren Auftakt hat. Dazu wünsche ich Sie alle herzlich willkommen. Die Konferenz nimmt Projekt und Ausstellung in die darin formulierten Denk- und Suchbewegungen auf, um Assoziations- und Analyseräume zum Begriff und Phänomen Arbeit in Zeiten von Globalisierung und Flexibilisierung zu erweitern. Während die Ausstellung Blicke auf Arbeit in einer filmischen Phänomenologie von weltweit entstandenen Kurzfilmen zusammenbringt, nimmt die Konferenz diese filmischen Verdichtungen auf und bringt sie mit Wissensbeständen und Zugriffen aus unterschiedlichen disziplinären Feldern zusammen. Ich möchte an dieser Stelle nur einen kurzen Ausblick auf das Konferenzprogramm der nächsten Tage geben. Zum Auftakt wird heute Abend Thomas Elsaesser in seiner nachfolgenden Keynote den thematischen Zugriff und Bogen zwischen Ausstellung und Konferenz spannen. Unter dem Titel »Mit Farocki denken« ist der morgige Tag Harun Farocki gewidmet. Begleiter, Freunde, langjährige Weggefährten zeichnen in einer Serie von Präsentationen sein vielfältiges Wirken und facettenreiches Werk in persönlichen Reflexionen nach. Am Samstag bilden ausgewählte Workshops, Projektfilme sowie ein Set von assoziativen Begriffsfeldern den visuellen und reflexiven Ausgangspunkt, um aktuelle, politische, ästhetische und ökonomische Debatten zu Fragen der Arbeit in 4 Panels zu verhandeln. Ich möchte kurz die zentralen Begriffe benennen. Hände, Werkzeug, Gesten wird das erste Segment sein. Kreis, Rhythmus, Ritual. Hingabe, Genauigkeit, Berufung und zum Schluss Inwertsetzung. Allen Beteiligten mein herzlichen Dank für ihr Kommen und Mitwirken. Den multidisziplinären Zugriff ernst nehmen, haben wir Ideen und Format dieser Konferenz gemeinsam mit Eine und Harun Farocki, mit dem Goethe-Institut Boston und mit dem internationalen Forschungskolleg Arbeit und Lebenslauf in globalgeschichtlicher Perspektive, Rework, an der Humboldt-Universität entwickelt. Mein Dank an dieser Stelle geht an Eine, an Detlef Gericke-Schönhagen und Andreas Eckert dafür, dass unsere konstruktive Zusammenarbeit zu dieser Form der Konferenz geführt hat. Ich übergebe nun das Wort an Andreas Eckert, Leiter des internationalen Forschungskollegs Arbeit und Lebenslauf in globalgeschichtlicher Perspektive, Rework, an der Humboldt-Universität und nachfolgend an Detlef Gericke-Schönhagen, der jetzt Leiter des Goethe-Instituts in Vilnius ist. Uns allen wünsche ich spannende und sicherlich erkenntnisreiche Tage. Herzlich willkommen.
All right, schönen guten Abend and good evening. As this is an international bilingual conference, I was asked to welcome you in English, and I'm happy to do so. I have to confess that I'm a historian of Africa, and even worse, a social historian of Africa. So my approach to work and labor will differ, I'm afraid, quite considerably from the majority of participants at the conference. So I decided to start with a quote from a writer, a dead white male writer, I'm afraid, and the quote is this: "You can't eat 8 hours a day, nor drink for 8 hours a day, nor make love for 8 hours. All you can do for 8 hours is work." This is a quote from William Faulkner, the American writer and laureate of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Faulkner refers to the fact that work occupies a central place in human existence. However, over the last centuries, the place of work has continuously changed. What is still regarded, at least in most Western countries, as normal work relationship, lifelong occupation, sufficient income to take care of a family, generous social security, was in fact never normal and represented a reality only for a small minority of people, mainly in the Western world. What will be normal in the future, at least accordingly to a number of researchers, are temporary contracts and part-time work. A happy vision for some, but probably a horror vision for many. During the last few decades, the theme of labor/work did not rank high among researchers in the humanities and social science and was regarded as a somehow unsexy topic. This has changed recently with new dynamism in the field, and our center, Rework, tries to fuel this dynamism. And much of the new interest in work and intellectual excitement about the topic is related to two developments. First, the opening up of perspectives on work that includes non-European world regions, that include meanings, concepts, and practices of work in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and so on. And secondly, to go beyond a restricted definition of work as gainful employment, but to include many other activities in order to define work. I would like to emphasize only one aspect. Labor/work is an eminently political category. A growing number of people worldwide, and increasingly also in Europe and North America, work under extremely precarious and exploitative conditions. Labor was and is, for the majority of people, not so much self-realization and pleasure, but mainly dependence and burden. However, intellectual debates about labor can be a lot of fun and pleasure and excitement. And this will be definitely true, I hope, for the conference Labor in a Single Shot, to which I also would like to welcome. And I'm very grateful to the Haus der Kulturen der Welt and to its director Bernd Scherer who allowed us to join in, so to speak, and also to provide some space for our fellows, some past and some current fellows, to reflect about Harun Farocki's work and what it means to the ways we think about labor. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Guten Abend, mein Name ist Detlef Gericke. Ich habe früher das Goethe-Institut Boston geleitet und leite jetzt das Goethe-Institut Vilnius. Das Projekt, was Sie unten sehen, hat im Goethe-Institut Boston angefangen. 1995 machte Harun Farocki einen Film, Arbeiter verlassen die Fabrik, in dem er einmal sagt, unser Leben besteht zu 95% aus Arbeit und zu 5% aus Freizeit. Aber der Film, so wie wir ihn kennen, dreht dieses Verhältnis um. Er besteht zu 95% aus Freizeit und nur 5% spielen in der Arbeitswelt. Er machte diesen Film zum 100. Jubiläum des Films und wir fragten ihn mal, Harun, was wirst du denn zum 120. Jubiläum des Films machen? Und mir fiel es tatsächlich vorhin ein, zum 120. Jubiläum des Films, was in genau 3 Wochen ist, am 19. März 2015, 120 Jahre davor haben die Brüder Lumière ihren Film in Lyon gedreht. Dafür haben Harun und Antje die Ausstellung gemacht, die wir unten sehen können. Eine Ausstellung, die dieses Verhältnis umdreht. Es geht zu 95% um Arbeit und zu 5% um Dinge, die man auch als Freizeit bezeichnen könnte, weil die im Grunde Arbeit sind. Ich habe die Ehre, heute Abend jemanden vorzustellen, der Harun Farockis Leben und Harun Farockis Arbeit seit 1976 genau verfolgt, analysiert und immer wieder essayistisch oder wissenschaftlich kommentiert und beschrieben hat. Es ist Thomas Elsaesser. Thomas Elsaesser war Professor an der Universität in Amsterdam, hat da die Fakultät für Medien und Kultur aufgebaut. Er ist von 2006 bis 2012 Professor an der Universität in Yale gewesen und seitdem bis heute Professor an der Columbia University in New York. Er hat in deutscher Sprache zahlreiche Bücher und Aufsätze geschrieben über Filmästhetik, Filmgeschichte, Hollywood, neue Medien, Videokunst und hat in englischer Sprache ein wichtiges Buch über Harun Farocki geschrieben und zahlreiche Aufsätze und Essays. Wie gesagt, er kennt ihn seit 1976 und ist einer der besten Kenner von Harun Farockis Entwicklung und dem Phänomen Harun Farocki. In dem In der Keynote-Speech, die uns Thomas Elsaesser gleich geben wird, geht es um die zwei großen Interessen und Leidenschaften, die Harun Farokkis Leben und Werk geprägt haben über 50 Jahre hinweg. Das eine ist die Arbeit, die Arbeitsroutinen, symbolisiert oder verkörpert in der Hand. Das andere ist die Simulation und das Rollenspiel, verkörpert im menschlichen Auge. Das Auge als ein Organ für die Überwachung einerseits und für die Kontrolle und ein Organ andererseits, was mit einer hohen Bereitwilligkeit sich belügen zu lassen. Dieses Verhältnis zwischen Auge und Hand, zwischen Arbeitsabläufen und Simulation und Rollenspiel hat in unterschiedlichen Anteilen Haruns Lebenswerk geprägt und wie und in welcher Weise sich das in der Ausstellung ausdrückt, die wir hier unten im Erdgeschoss sehen und vieles andere auch noch, wird uns Thomas Elsaesser jetzt vortragen. Vielen Dank, Herr Elsaesser.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank an Detlef Gericke für seine freundlichen Worte. Mein Dank natürlich auch an Antje Ehmann und ebenfalls an Roy Grundmann von Boston, der mich vor einigen Monaten zu einer Keynote in Boston eingeladen hatte, und an Bernd Scherer und seine Mitarbeiter hier am Haus der Kulturen der Welt. I am deeply honored by this invitation and I'm also humbled, especially by the thought that so many among you, whom I have the privilege of addressing tonight, knew Harun Farocki and knew him much better than I did. They were closer to him personally as well as professionally, and most important perhaps, who can speak, and indeed I'm sure will speak, about his work more concisely and above all, more in the spirit of his work than I can. This is not said out of false modesty, but stated as a fact, and as such, it has its own logic and justification. It is one of the reasons why my lecture will be held in English, because my function has been that of Harun Farocki's translator, not just because occasionally I translated parts of his texts, but because it fell upon me to translate the initial unfamiliarity of his films into the language of Anglophone journalism and subsequently into academic prose. And in this instance, the old saying, traduttore e traditore, to be a translator is to be a traitor, is even truer than in other cases, considering that nothing could be further from the descriptive precision of Farocki's cinematic thought and his writing than the discourse of contemporary academia. Therefore, I think it is only fitting that tonight of all nights, I remain true to the role I've played in his life for almost 40 years. When the organizers asked me to open this colloquium, they also gave me some indication of what they wished me to address and to concentrate on. Arbeit als Thema, Film als Medium. I'm accepting this brief, although I allow myself to put it in my own words. I shall be speaking about the invisibility of labor and the labor of invisibility. Two of Farocki's abiding preoccupations across his long career and the prolific output are his interest in work, work routines, and work practices, often associated with manual labor and the human hand, and its ability, as Farocki puts it, to carry, to grasp, to count money, or to caress. And his equally tenacious study of simulation, of make-believe and role-play, often connected with the eye and its ability to act as a controlling instance or an organ of monitoring and surveillance, but also as an organ both easily deceived and on occasion, in life as well as in art, to be willingly deceived for pleasure and play. Both work and play are in evidence among the Lumièresque films made in different parts of the globe. For instance, here you have one about work, and here you have one about play, and which are now online and on show as Labor in a Single Shot. Hand and eye are, of course, connected to filmmaking, and especially to the kind of filmmaking as practiced by Farocki himself, writing, staging, screening, as well as editing and montage. But work and play also encompass a political archaeology of the 19th and 20th century. We've just heard a little bit about that. Its emancipatory aspirations in Schiller's Ästhetische Erziehung, or in its social utopias of Fourier and Phalanstère, followed by the false hope and cruel deceptions in the 20th century. By the late 19th century, due to the migration from the land into the cities, with peasants no longer tilling the fields, but as workers toiling in factories, honorable work became the labor power that the proletariat had to carry to market. Thus, throughout the Marxian tradition, a tension persists. On the one hand, there is wage labor as slave labor, considered as both evidence and expression of capitalist exploitation, contrasted with work as a means of self-fulfillment and self-realization, true to the motto, Marx's motto, to each according to his needs, from each according to his ability, or the other way around, of which jedem das Seine is the cruel and cynically perverted echo. Quite a few of Farocki's films are extended self-interrogations of this tension between the dignity of labor and the dehumanizing conditions often imposed on it. Films like I, Machine, for instance, chart the increasingly asymmetric relation between human hands, eyes, and machines, as bodies seem to become the weakest link in a chain of automated interaction that promotes the eye at the expense of the hand and promotes seeing as registering and controlling, overseeing as recognizing and understanding, thereby putting an end also to the epistemological equation according to which to see is to know. These transformations of the body and the senses in relation to machines and weapons are often cast in Farocki as meditations about distance and proximity, of actions conducted in remote locations, but whose consequences must be accounted for also at home. As such, distance and proximity are often reflexively doubled by an interrogation about what can be said and what can be shown, at times even accompanied by a very personal bodily self-reference, as in Nicht löschbare Feuer from 1969, where the incommensurability of a certain reality and its representation already anticipates the paradoxes of aerial reconnaissance in Bilder der Welt und Inschrift des Krieges from 1989, as well as the ethical impasse and bodily trauma of drone strikes and joystick warfare in serious games from 2009. I noticed 1969, 1989, 2009, every 20 years, Farocki has made a major statement on this topic. As far as Arbeit als Thema, Film als Medium is concerned, Farocki entered the debate at a time when filmmakers made determined attempts to document the situation of and give a voice to what was then called the working class, through the cinema as medium and filmmaking as the means. It was a characteristic move among directors, especially in West Germany and in Berlin, West Berlin, and it led to the brief period of the so-called Arbeiterfilme. Yet, however tempting and even well-intentioned, this gesture of solidarity with the victims of capitalist oppression may have seemed in the wake of May '68, when student protesters, along with left intellectuals, tried to mobilize the workers on behalf of liberation struggles, including their own liberation. There were those, and Farocki was among them, who saw grave dangers in the means, the methods, and the strategies deployed. It is instructive to revisit the ferocity with which Farocki and the writers around the journal Filmkritik attacked what they saw as the facile self-identification of students with workers and of filmmaking with factory labor. Johannes Behringer, for instance, a fellow DFFB student of Farocki's and a contributor to Filmkritik, put it in a sharp and sharp-eyed polemic about workers' films in 1975. To commit oneself to serving the cause of the working class would have required, first of all, the realization that as a director, one cannot have a free pass to the reality of the proletariat as easily as to a left-wing film festival. The interests of the working class are by no means automatically identical with those of the filmmakers. Stuck between the emancipatory needs of the workers and the capitalist media needs to package these needs and sell them as social issues, it puts the filmmaker in a difficult and dubious position. What this difficult and dubious position might mean in filmic terms is made clear in a devastating review by Farocki himself about one of these workers' films from 1975. We know as much about the work that these workers do at the beginning of the film as we do at the end. The men always bang the obligatory hammer 3 times before they have another round of dialogue. You remember, they lower the hammer and they start. You remember what I told you the other day. Not once does somebody bang his finger. Nicolas Dutsch, an actor by now notorious in Berlin for his role as the working man, defiantly raises his chin even when somebody asks for the time of day. The director neither possesses a film language nor is he without one. It is as if he had sent somebody off telling him, go and shoot some footage of the workers at their benches. In fact, it is the director who sends himself. The same gesture that in the film allocates meaning to images and to sentences, others use to allocate housing, to assign jobs, or to select children at school. It is a gesture of bureaucratic terror. Farocki goes on to describe in detail what he perceives as the filmmaker's contradictory use of the zoom lens, of actors, of music, and he concludes, I quote, "What a pity there are so few who understand the politics of cinematic language." End of quote. Someone who did understand the politics of cinematic language at this point was Jean-Luc Godard, and Filmkritik's polemics strongly suggests Farocki's debt to Godard, who in 1972 made his own workers' film, Tout va bien, with Yves Montand and Jane Fonda, partly in response to a film by Marin Karmitz, Coup pour coup. I would like to show now the first extract, please.
C'est assez. Il y a 2 films assez récents qui se ressemblent, mais qui dans les méthodes et qui dans la fabrication diffèrent, qui me semblent intéressants. Ces 2 films, l'un s'appelle Coup pour coup de Marine Karmitz, qu'il a fait avec des ouvrières d'Elbeuf, et un que j'ai fait avec Jean-Pierre Gorin qui s'appelle Tout va bien. On peut dire que ces 2 films veulent lutter pour, disons, ceux qui veulent du changement, et en particulier l'élément dominant, c'est-à-dire les exploités, les opprimés, et leur représentation principale en France, qui est la classe ouvrière, hommes et femmes. Coup pour coup va directement voir les ouvrières d'Elbeuf, par exemple, et fait un film avec elles. À mon avis, c'est mon avis personnel, il saute une étape, c'est-à-dire il pense qu'on peut directement écouter, parler, comme ça, ayant été privé de communication pendant longtemps, qu'on peut se mettre au service sans problème. Nous, on pense qu'il y a un problème et que ce problème, c'est le moyen même qu'on emploie, qui jusqu'à maintenant a été entre les mains des gens contre lesquels on lutte, et qui fait qu'on ne le, malgré notre meilleure volonté, on ne le domine pas bien, et que souvent on croit faire un film au service d'eux, et qu'on risque même de faire un film contre. On ne s'en rend pas bien compte. Alors à mon avis, si tu veux, tout va bien, plutôt que filmer simplement des filles ou des OS qui parlent, ou de les mettre en scène, justement, dans ce mot même de mettre en scène, il y a tout un contenu, parce qu'en France, qui met en scène la France, pour l'instant, à mon avis, c'est quand même Pompidou et Marcellin. Et donc, que la manière qu'on a de mettre en scène, dont moi-même, qui essaye de lutter contre Pompidou et Marcellin, la manière que j'ai de mettre en scène est fortement conditionnée parce que j'ai appris à l'école, si tu veux, même en ayant quitté l'école. Bon, alors donc, je dois trouver le moyen d'aller vers ces gens-là, et puis surtout de les laisser parler. Parce qu'il y a quelque chose de très frappant, c'est quand on interviewe des ouvriers, aussi bien dans un film d'un gauchiste comme Rocard récemment à la télévision, que dans un film d'un droitier réac comme Fontanet récemment à la télévision à armes égales, ces gens, ils n'ont que 15 secondes, ils n'ont jamais parlé de toute l'année. On leur laisse 15 secondes ou même 3 minutes pour parler. On leur dit, alors que pensez-vous de la grève? Alors que pensez-vous de votre sort? Mais qui peut répondre, ayant eu la bouche cousue, qui peut répondre?
Farocki, too, tried to give a filmic response to the workers' film in his first full-length feature, Zwischen zwei Kriegen. But he took on a more formidable challenge than local strikes during the briefly volatile period in the early 1970s. Instead, he tried to answer one of the most puzzling questions of the post-war labor movement, namely why the German working class could be so easily seduced by Nazism and desert the communist alternative. Key to these questions seems to have been an essay by Alfred Sohn-Rethel, whose 1932 analyses of the political economy of emergent Nazism were republished in the journal Kursbuch in 1970 under the title Zur politischen Ökonomie Deutschlands. What I want to retain from this encounter is how Sohn-Rethel also allowed Farocki to better understand the kind of labor relations he himself, as a filmmaker, was involved in or indeed trapped in. Parallel to working on Zwischen zwei Kriegen, for which he failed to get funding, Farocki had to make a living, which he did with all sorts of jobs, as he explains in the film itself. Because I couldn't get any money to make this film, I had to earn money with other work. I worked in the culture business. I earned money by writing copy text. I took on every job which required the writer to hide sensuality behind words. As we see the pile of photos from a Playboy-type magazine, we notice the words Kunst, nicht knicken, art, don't bend. But that is precisely what Farocki does. He bends art and makes of it a Verbund, a form of connectivity and synergy, but under very special conditions, whereby, in Sohn-Rethel's argument, the waste products of the iron industry were used to good effect in the coal industry. It is this principle of recycling and repurposing, of combining apparently unrelated or even antagonistic elements, which becomes Farocki's main working method, and also the key to a different self-understanding of the filmmaker as a distinct kind of worker in the culture industries, positioned between the worker in the factory and the autonomous artist. This is how he explains the principle of Verbund as it applies to his own working conditions. Following the example of the steel industry, I try to create a Verbund with my work. The basic research for a project I finance with a radio broadcast. Some of the books I use, I then review for the book programs, and many of the things I notice during this kind of work end up in my television features. In Farocki's subsequent feature film, Etwas wird sichtbar, from 1981, a film that self-examines precisely political militancy and the difficulties of speaking on behalf of others, that is, the presumption of the workers' films that they can speak on behalf of others, while Farocki shows his protagonist trapped in the ubiquity of press photographs meant to paralyze the will to action, we find a voiceover passage that directly addresses Farocki's own dilemma as a political filmmaker. Discussing the relation of manual labor and creative labor, again a topic dear to Alfred Sohn-Rethel, Farocki comes to the following conclusion. It is not a question of doing either one or the other, but of joining the two. When you clear up your room by moving everything to one side, that's easy. Or when in your workshop, every time you use a tool, you put it back where it belongs. That's easy too. It's easy to produce something systematically, like a machine, but it's also easy to produce something new and once only, like an artist. In other words, both these alternatives seem to him too easy. Now, the passage from Etwas wird sichtbar echoes actual images from a scene in Zwischen zwei Kriegen, where we see Farocki trying to make tabula rasa. You see, he does exactly that, pushing everything off the table. Half in anger and frustration, half impatient to try and make a new start. This then was the challenge at a point when Farocki realized that the so-called independent filmmaker in the Federal Republic during the 70s and 80s was anything but independent. Instead, now that the financing of films had become a matter of state subsidies or of commissions handed out by state-funded television broadcasters such as WDR or ZDF, independent filmmaking embodied and exemplified the dilemma of serving two masters. As autonomous artist, the filmmaker-auteur was expected to uphold the ideals of bourgeois individualism and personal freedom, which bourgeois liberalism, having cast its lot entirely with capitalism, also after the war in Germany, which bourgeois liberalism could not live up to or would not implement. Carrying the burden of someone else's ideals was the price artists had to pay for their autonomy, their creativity, the outsourced labor of the dominant class. This was servant number one. But the independent filmmaker was also the servant of capital in another sense, where his freelance labor was used to fill the media slots that were deemed too unpromising or too unprofitable to invest major resources in or stake the reputation of a channel with. In a remarkable essay in Filmkritik from August 1975 entitled Notwendige Abwechslung und Vielfalt, Required Choice and Diversity of Opinion, Farocki argued that it suited state-controlled television, which had to demonstrate political balance, Ausgewogenheit, in its programming. It suited television to nurture the subjectivity of its Autoren as independent spirits, eigenwillige Künstler, because it allowed television to win both ways. Producers could boast with being experimental and bask in the prestige of being patrons to the arts by giving Autoren a late-night programming slot at relatively little cost. But should these Autoren, as some of them did, turn out to be too experimental or too innovative and cause commotion or even a scandal, they simply would not receive further commissions. In retrospect, it's remarkable how clearly, in his analysis of the independent filmmaker working for television, Farocki analyzed and indeed anticipated the dilemmas that were to reproduce themselves since the 1990s, when politically motivated filmmakers, now the German public service television, as the Öffentlich-Rechtliche, had internalized all the criteria of its commercial rivals and given over those late-night film slots to interminable talk shows, when political filmmakers moved out of television and into art spaces, exchanging producers for curators and public service television for publicly funded contemporary art museums. This may well have been one of the reasons why Farocki was and has remained the most successful and productive artist of this crossover generation. That is, of filmmakers who made the transition from cinema and television to installation art, from black box to grey tube, and from tube to white cube, all the while retaining their political convictions and, in most cases, keeping intact their artistic integrity. Having lived through it all with television in the 70s, Farocki was well equipped to take on a new set of cultural industries in the 1990s and to work out for himself what creative constraints were necessary in order to navigate and survive in this new art space environment. For this, if for no other reason, it is well worth returning to Farocki's writings and essays from the 1970s. They yield, for instance, precious insights into the situation of the new precariat in the art world today, all those working as interns and backup crew, as helpers and aspirants, for modest pay and even more modest prospects. Schnittstelle, interface, from 1995 is the result of this process of reorientation, at once a manifesto for the new dispositif of multi-channel composition and presentation, and a reflection on what it was that had hitherto motivated him as a filmmaker and as a writer. Restaging, at the same time breaking down the traditional division of labor within filmmaking between, for instance, scripting and filming, Farocki shows fragments from his previous films while explaining the difference between editing film and editing video, primarily by reference to hands and fingers. In one case, touching the film strip to feel the cut, even prior to seeing or hearing it. And in another case, pushing buttons and turning a dial, that is for video, as if adjusting the frequency on a radio set in order to fine-tune and sharpen reception. Underpinning both, however, is the subtle alternation between Schreibtisch, writing desk, and Schneidetisch, editing table. Their homophonic proximity in German, the German language, Schreib- und Schneidetisch, lending credibility to Farocki's main point, namely that the work of writing and the work of editing are mutually conditioning each other, where each can take on the function of the other, leaving out, combining with, creating gaps or joining, in a constant back and forth process rather than succeeding each other as in mainstream industrial filmmaking. In many ways, Schnittstelle is the most directly autobiographical account of Farocki's own working methods, a kind of self-reflexive, retrospective rumination on his own occupation, performing a split and making a cut, as if to announce also a new beginning, almost as if to take back the tabula rasa gesture of 15 years earlier that I just showed you. At about the same time, Farocki was also returning to the problem of the Arbeiterfilme with a parallel project, now not from a militant interventionist perspective, and more as an archivist and archaeologist. I'm referring to Arbeiter verlassen die Fabrik. Also made in 1995 and formally inaugurating a series of compilation films such as Der Ausdruck der Hände from 1997. Insofar as both films start from an archive of cinematic tropes or visual motifs. Among this increasingly popular form of collecting recurrent cinematic objects or cinematic scenes and combining them into so-called supercuts, Arbeiter verlassen die Fabrik sticks out not only because it was one of the very first. It is also carefully folded and layered as a meditation on the changes of modern labor conditions, of factory work, on the relation between men and women on the factory floor, conducted mainly across a wide-ranging interrogation of this single filmic motif, as old as the medium itself, that of workers leaving the factory. Whereas Der Ausdruck der Hände gives us a kind of poetological existential reading of hands across directors as different as Sam Fuller and Robert Bresson, and suggesting the possibility of a choreography of gestures that might serve as a grammar of film, Arbeiter verlassen die Fabrik examines its thesaurus of images, its Bilderschatz, not in search of a grammar, but in relation to their respective historical moment. More important than their fictive or documentary status are the recurring features and intersecting contexts across time and political systems, which chart a remarkable history. Through the different ways that the end of the working day has been filmed over 100 years, the fragments speak of the cinema and of the working class, but also of the end of cinema and the end of the working class. Especially the end of the working class revolves around the issue of invisibility, manifest in the camouflage of appearance. Here is a brief quote from Arbeiter verlassen die Fabrik. Today, you cannot tell whether someone in the street comes from work, has been doing sports in the gym, or is returning from collecting his welfare check. End of quote. In other words, work, leisure, and unemployment have become, at a certain level of abstraction, Farocki claims, which manifests itself in outward experience, interchangeable and therefore invisible. Whereas people were once economically defined by their labor power and socially defined by their class, they now tend to present themselves in the public sphere as soldiers of fashion, their camouflage provided by branded clothes and leisure pursuits. In asking why directors film the exit and not the entry, why there are so few scenes inside the factory, and why these people are running, Arbeiter verlassen die Fabrik revisits the failed, flawed, or misguided attempts from the 1970s to make the cinema a tool for representing the site of industrial work and for making visible the situation of the workers. In particular, Farocki echoes the questions that Jean-Luc Godard tried to answer in the interview I just showed you, where he points out that almost all the spaces where our lives are decided, or where most of our productivity of the nation takes place, are off limits to the camera. Besides factories, this is true of ministries and other public buildings, just as it is true of the metro, of museums, or the airport. Can we have the second clip, please?
Nous, on prétend le sacro-saint droit au travail, si tu veux, qui est la tarte à la crème du patronat français. Moi, si je me pointe, moi, informateur, cinéaste, ayant le droit d'exercer mon travail de cinéaste, c'est-à-dire de filmer, je n'ai pas le droit d'aller presque nulle part. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on vit sous le régime de la propriété privée. Mais je n'ai même pas le droit d'aller dans les entreprises dites d'État. Je n'ai pas le droit de filmer dans le métro. Je n'ai pas le droit de filmer dans un musée. Je n'ai pas le droit de filmer dans une usine. Je n'ai pas le droit de filmer hors lit. J'ai le droit de filmer quasiment dans aucun des endroits qui représentent le 80% de l'activité productrice des Français. Où est le droit au travail?
Vous êtes en train d'enregistrer là?
L'exploiteur ne raconte jamais à l'exploité comment il l'exploite. Donc nous, dans ce raconte, nous qui sommes précisément...
Godard here anticipates some of Farocki's remarks when explaining what motivated him in Labor in a Single Shot. In each city, most of the work activities happen behind closed doors. Often labor is not only invisible, but also unimaginable. Therefore, it is vital to undertake detailed research, to open one's eyes and to set oneself in motion. Where do we see which kind of labor? What happens in the center of a city? What occurs at the periphery? What is hidden? What kind of labor process could be an interesting cinematographic challenge? As the many videos of labor in a single shot prove, the situation has changed considerably since the 1970s, not least because today, and you'll see it in many of those videos, today it is as much the camera and the technical equipment that can remain invisible as it is the owner or supervisor who can make the workplace unfilmable. And yet, precisely here lies the paradox that Farocki is only too aware of. One of the major reasons why workplaces now seem to be much more open to the human eye and the camera gaze is that these places now are capable of co-opting such representations into their own self-presentation, and thus make it part of their self-promotion. This is especially true about one of the places that Godard mentions, namely the museum. Much has changed since Godard clandestinely filmed his three protagonists in Bande à part, trying to break the record of the fastest visit to the Louvre. Now we have prestigious names fronting well-funded productions of films about the Louvre, Nicolas Philibert, the Hermitage in Petersburg, Alexander Sokurov's Russian Ark, about the National Gallery in London, Frederick Wiseman. The Vienna Kunsthistorische Museum even sponsored two recent films, a fiction film by Jem Cohen, Museum Hours, and a documentary, Das große Museum, by Johann Holzhausen. Action films, too, can now be shot in a museum. For instance, Skyfall, one of the recent James Bond films, has a scene in front of a famous Turner painting in the National Gallery in London, and Tom Tykwer had permission to film a wild shootout at the Guggenheim in New York for his thriller, The International. While these promotional moves to attract more tourists fits in with the general trend to make museums a destination of a mass audience and art exhibitions the new mass medium, and while this possibly benefits even filmmakers and installation artists like Farocki, an equally important reason for the sudden openness of hitherto camera-shy spaces is that much of what affects our lives or determines the economic fate of a country has become invisible by its very nature. We only need to think of high-speed electronic trading, where billions of euros or dollars shift continents within nanoseconds, or the invisible footprints we all leave whenever we go online with our laptops or smartphones. Several of Farocki's films and installations, certainly since the early 1990s and the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, are like the extended probe into what could be called the new invisibility. It corresponds to what Farocki himself calls controlling observation, meaning a visuality to which no human observer corresponds, and for which the body and the senses, touch, hearing, motion, affect, have become the protectively invoked stand-ins. For instance, the Bentham Panopticon prison that Farocki shows in action in the opening scenes of I Thought I Was Seeing Convicts, with its tight alignment of camera eye and gun sight, was, as Farocki himself remarks, already obsolete when he filmed it, on the way to being replaced by new tagging, tracking, and deterritorializing surveillance technologies. This new invisibility poses a special challenge to the filmmaker because, as Farocki argues, I quote, with the increase in electronic control devices, everyday life will become just as hard to portray as everyday work already is. I take Farocki's point here to be not only that he wants to map out the limits of the visible in the very age of vision machines, but that probably as a result of these vision machines, invisibility itself has become a kind of commodity, especially within the commercially high profit but politically low profile Verbund systems that have emerged from the synergies between computer software firms, arms manufacturers, security specialists, and consumer service industries. Invisibility, in other words, is something actively produced rather than simply an absence, a lack, or a deficiency. As if in response to this challenge, Farocki embarked on a series of videos and installations, especially Ernste Spiele from 2009-2010 and Parallele 1-4, 2012-2014, which take up simulation as one of the crucial strategies of this new invisibility, combining an investigation into virtual reality and computer graphics with motifs from his earlier work, notably from Bilder der Welt und Inschrift des Krieges, from Gefängnisbilder or Deep Play, but also from Leben BRD and Die Schöpfer der Einkaufswelten. Although what I have just referred to as the new invisibility is new only in the sense that Farocki's installations may have helped us to identify it more clearly, the aspect I want to draw attention to in the present context is the way Farocki aligns his exploration of invisibility with different types of labor. Foremost among them is the military labor of invisibility, which may start with the varieties of camouflage of soldiers' uniforms, camouflage of interrogation centers or rendition places, or camouflage of bombers as stealth bombers, but also encompassing official disinformation campaigns, secrecy in the name of national security, and includes the invisibility of casualties in armed conflict, not just the collateral damage among civilians of smart bombs and drone strikes, not even the increasingly invisible body bags of dead returning soldiers, but also the invisibility of the psychic wounds that, especially in the United States, the long drawn-out wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have inflicted on thousands of young men and their families. Ernste Spiele connects this labor of invisibility which camouflages those traumata by twice removing them from the lived reality very persuasively with computer games and other simulation techniques as they migrate between battlefields and blockbuster movies, suggesting that we are sold enhanced visibility, but on delivery we receive ever more densely textured invisibility. Behind it lurks a possible comparison between an industrial workforce and a military establishment that increasingly outsources its labor to commercial contractors, raising the further question of what might be the consequences, where not only the workers are leaving the factory more and more to be replaced by robots, but also when soldiers are leaving the battlefield to be replaced by remote-controlled drones. Does it mean that wars will henceforth be fought, not, as some science fiction writers had imagined, by machines fighting machines, but by machines fighting human beings, and perhaps eventually fighting the human race itself? The great recent AI debate, artificial intelligence debate in recent years, has certainly envisaged such a scenario. The simulated therapy sessions of serious games, on the other hand, are a reminder of another site for the more traditional labor of invisibility, hospital personnel and nursing staff, housework and childcare, in short, the typically gendered labor of empathy and attentive listening, or in the case of self-help groups and wellness centers, the labor of those who minister to some of the narcissistic wounds that the West is afflicted with or has inflicted on itself. Farocki's Leben BRD, for instance, is, besides so many other things, also a veritable compendium of the different situations of affective labor, as we have come to call it. The very fact, however, that it now has a name indicates that such labor has indeed become less invisible. Yet it took at least 2 generations of concerted feminist effort to put it on the political agenda, and making it part of the social contract that at least the European welfare state now has with its citizen. Yet the more visible certain kinds of affective labor have become, the more the boundaries of invisibility seem to have shifted elsewhere, a phenomenon I want to briefly sketch under the dual heading of labor as waiting and waiting as labor. To the extent that factory labor in the West is increasingly replaced by work in the service industry, by jobs in administration, in planning or supervision, or no work at all, the primary labor we in the developed world give to society, as well as to the dominant economic system, is time and attention. And much of this attentive time comes in the form of perceptual labor, spent in front of screens, rather than physical labor, expended in making things, tasks that have been outsourced to countries like China, Bangladesh, or Vietnam. There can be little doubt that in this process, attention has become one of the most critical and crucial of resources, so that within what is now called the attention economy, we also find different definitions of work, or practices of work. Watching a screen is work, both at the workplace and at home. At home, we flip TV channels, we surf the web, we monitor our incoming emails, update our Facebook page, or service our bank accounts online, or electronically pay our gas bills. But I think one can go further and say, waiting is working, and working means waiting. Besides the healthcare and wellness business, there are now many occupations where people are paid to be on standby. Not just in such traditional standby jobs such as the police or the fire brigade, but when working as, let's say, security guards, as the people manning monitors of surveillance cameras, or as vendors in luxury boutiques at airports. All of them spend most of their days waiting until something happens. If for some, this is called information processing as work, for others, it is listening to undecided customers that is work. And for yet others, it is waiting, just waiting that is work. In short, a whole range of states of body and mind that used to be seen as passive are now activities, and even if poorly remunerated, are classified as work. This reversibility of waiting as working and working as waiting may not qualify for the kind of invisibility that I have claimed as typical for quite different and heterogeneous sectors of our present social productivity, But it too inhabits a zone of indeterminacy that blends into the last category of labor of invisibility that I want to mention, namely the kind of invisibility that comes from ubiquity, by which I mean the blurring of boundaries between work and play, as opposed to the Schillerian ideal of work as play. That is to say, the labor of invisibility as the effort it takes no longer to be able to distinguish between work and play, between self-promotion and creativity, or to mistake self-optimization as self-knowledge and self-fulfillment. These category blurs are well known and widely considered to be the inevitable consequences of the transition from an industrial and manufacturing society to the post-industrial information and service society. But the question is perhaps not whether physical labor has indeed been substituted by mental labor. Even in our Western societies, it has not. The films brought together in Labor in a Single Shot are eloquent proof of the diversity of work situations and working conditions today. And on the other hand, they document some of the harsh working conditions that still prevail or have always prevailed in many parts of the globe. In addition, as an example of how bodily exertion in the form of leisure and bodily exertion in the form of physical labor can share the same space, interact with each other, and yet sharply contradict each other, one could cite one of the videos from Tel Aviv. Set in a gym where a black maintenance cleaner and white fitness fan exercise together, as it were, when observed across the minimal visibility of their differences as they present themselves in uncanny similarity and bodily synchronicity. Can we have the clip, please? The strategic placing of the camera and the presence of a mirror in this clip invite also a different kind of reflection. We observe the finally rather pitiful attempt to compensate for the lack of manual labor or its meaninglessness as a means to self-fulfillment, which then produces its own parody in grown men behaving like hamsters in a treadmill, flanked by someone who serves them in a physically demanding yet socially demeaning role, so that what the maintenance worker and the workout men have in common is that their activities cancel rather than complement each other, since they illustrate two sides of the lack of self-fulfillment today in the act of physical labor. As the philosophical text that names and explains these changes in bodily regimes, we tend to cite Gilles Deleuze's essay on the controlled societies, in which Deleuze updates and extends Michel Foucault's disciplinary regime. But the particular mixture of indefiniteness and urgency that accompanies the intensified value extraction from our bodies by the attention economy at both ends of the collapsed work-play divide was already put in pithy words by Theodor Adorno in his Minima Moralia in 1951. I cite a longish passage. The haste, the nervousness and restlessness observed since the rise of the big cities is now spreading in the manner of an epidemic, as did once the plague or cholera. In the process, forces are being unleashed that were undreamt of by the passers-by and flaneurs of the 19th century, a reference to Baudelaire and Benjamin. Everybody now must have projects all the time. The maximum must be extracted from leisure. Free time is pre-planned, used for special tasks, is crammed with visits to every conceivable sight or spectacle, or just filled with the fastest possible locomotion. The shadow of all this falls on intellectual work. It is done with bad conscience, as if it had been poached from some urgent, even if only imagined, occupation. To justify itself in its own eyes, it puts on a show of hectic activity performed under great pressure and with shortage of time, which excludes all reflection and therefore annihilates itself. The whole of life must look like a job, and by this resemblance to work, it conceals what is not yet directly devoted to pecuniary gains. End of quote. Perhaps it is this gesture of self-concealment in the full knowledge of its own bad conscience that I try to describe as the labor of invisibility in the service of ubiquity. In all these configurations, moving images play an ambiguous role, since they too now stand for an extension of the workplace rather than its opposite, as they did when Benjamin reflected on it in the 1930s. Farocki has taken due notice of this fact, specializing in his films on what he calls operational images, images that contain instructions or that require actions. Just as the waiting operators in front of their monitors at the places of work attentively scan video images for the clues of changes and signs of imminent danger that they may hold, so Farocki's particular method of what I now call forensic image archaeology reads images through other images while reconstructing the sedimented layers of reference their comparison and juxtaposition might uncover and disclose. What this seems to indicate is that the moving image has left the space of contemplation it had successfully claimed for the best part of the last century, that is, the last 100 years, entering instead the realm of monitoring and control as its new default value. Symptomatic are the many videos in Labor in a Single Shot collection where people are surrounded by different types of screens. Where they interact with control panels or sit in front of multiple image banks, supervising traffic junctions, giving running commentary on a horse race, as in this one here, or rendering two-dimensional images of a poor neighborhood in Sao Paulo in 3D, or Rio de Janeiro, in order for architects to redevelop the site. This new kinds of invisibility and the labor invested in them, in other words, require a rethink of strategies for making visible. And I see Labor in a Single Shot as a heroic attempt to do just that. On the ground of and against the horizon of what I have tried to sketch, namely the invisibility of labor and the labor of invisibility. Let me therefore, by way of conclusion, briefly outline what I see as some of the salient strategies, but not before asking Antje Ehmann to forgive me for discussing Labor in a Single Shot under the generic name Farocki, rather than stressing the joint nature of their enterprise. One might begin by saying that labor in a single shot is conceived as a way of reversing, or at least countering, the dominant logic of outsourcing labor, while nonetheless only too aware that not only multinationals like Apple, Mercedes, or IKEA practice outsourcing. Museum curators, short of fresh material, will travel the globe in search of new talent, and film festivals are equally anxious to tap new creative potential in developing and emerging countries by organizing talent campuses or offering seed and development money that ties such potential talent to their institution or to their brand. Labor in a single shot counters outsourcing by resourcing, but not in the way that the workers' films had considered handing cameras to striking workers, or in the way that anthropologists give camcorders to Amazon tribes in order for them to speak out against the iniquities of logging and the destruction of Brazilian rainforests. Labor in a single shot avoids both these traps of missionary empowerment by reflexively doubling the task at hand. Remember what Farocki said about the workers' films and Christian Ziva, that the director had made himself the servant of his own assignment. Hat sich selbst geschickt. He sent himself. Farocki is careful not to send himself, and so the assignment is multiply filtered and mediated, is refocused and made self-reflexive by empowering the eyes and the hands, the skill levels and temperament of the aspiring filmmakers indigenous to the cities visited. But the project is also reflexively doubled by its judicious mixture of freedom and constraint, the freedom to shoot anything the filmmakers found interesting, and the promise that everything submitted would be included. The constraints, that it had to be in one take, that it could be no longer than between 1 and 2 minutes, and as a kind of semi-optional extra, that it should show some awareness of the peculiar genius of the Lumière films. I think the mix worked wonderfully, and if I had more time, I would explore more fully in what ways, especially the third constraint, bore remarkable fruit, that is, the awareness of Lumière's films. But broadly speaking, the reference back to Lumière can be observed in the following features of these films, these videos. Many, if not all, the films are process-oriented, often in a typically Lumière way. Some actually manage to record an entire process and end by hinting how it starts all over again. Can we show the Iron Lady, please? There's also a very effective use of off-screen space as an element of surprise or conceptual reframing, again, a Lumière characteristic. Please, the underground musicians. see there, here there's a reframing, a kind of conceptual and auditory and visual reframing all in one take. A very special skill. And finally, some videos deploy another Lumière stylistic device, the division of the frame into separate action spaces that either comment on each other or offer two complementary perspectives on the same idea of concept. And that would apply to the Tel Aviv Gym film that I've just discussed. I want to end with the reason why I think the project can be situated within the broader horizon of invisibility of labor. Farocki, in the text that advertises the purposes and procedures of labor in a single shot, has this phrase, alle Arbeit ist Wiederholung. All work is repetition. And repetition is, of course, itself a powerful form of invisibility, so that the objective of labor in a single shot, its critical as well as its emancipatory mission, if you like, is to make us see again, to use the concentrated attention of the Lumière set of constraints to discover or rediscover the details, the gestures, the processes. In other words, to conduct just such an image forensics on work and play among today's everyday practices, and to look at the present as if it was a delicate and fragile archaeological site, with the tools provided by the very first cinematic auteur, the Lumière. The salient point was to discover the visible in this project, was to discover the visible within the invisibility induced by repetition, and not against the many kinds of invisibility that governments and military impose on us. This, of course, is the legacy that Farocki has given to all these young filmmakers in Rio de Janeiro, in Tel Aviv, in Berlin, Boston, Hangzhou, Hanoi, and many other places, so that they might reinvent the cinema their way and at the same time the Lumière way. It is also the legacy he has given to us, to cherish, to continue, and to remember him by. Thank you.